So if you haven't seen in my story, I was talking a little bit about spiritual mass. So I was going to do a little video quickly to put it into my feed for anybody else that might have missed it in the story. Now, spiritual mass is something we develop in. Spiritual mass is the ability in which we have recognized our consciousness. So recognize the source within us. And as we begin to recognize the source more, which means we begin to detach from ourselves, we begin to grow in what I would say spiritual mass. We become more of that connection. We become more of that truth, more of that expression of the one. And as we begin to detach from our sense of self more and more, which means we're thinking less, we're having less emotions, we're having less reactions, we're having all of the stuff that creates all of your problems and all of your worries and all of your stressing and all of your anxiety and all of your fears. We begin to detach more and more from that, because we are recognizing our consciousness, we are recognizing the source within as we begin to detach from the past and from our conditioning. We have a much greater ability to be within the ground of consciousness itself, which means you're more conscious throughout your day, you're more conscious throughout your living, and that consciousness, that connection is, as a very baseline, is like a deep contentment and a deep peace. And then out of that emanates the joy and compassion and passion, and it sets you on your life. It's from that place in which we move in the world. It's from that place in which we do act, speak, love, connect with others. And this is all called or gaining in spiritual mass. You're becoming more conscious of consciousness itself. So it means you're harnessing more of that connection. You're being more of what you truly are over what you're not, which is like your conditioning. And so the more conscious you become, the less conditioned you are, and the more spiritual mass, or the more light, the more transparent you become to the one, to consciousness itself. Now this takes time. You don't just, for me it's been 4 years, and that 4 years has been a heavy process of detaching from my emotions, detaching from my hurt, detaching from my pain, detaching from my need to be realised by others, detaching from my need to be something in myself, the need to obtain, the need for desire. All of these things over time begin to fall away as you realise consciousness more and more. Because what you're realising is you're realising the source. And the source, there is no lack in the source. It is one, it is infinite. And so as we realise the source, all of these lower ideas, all of these lower beliefs of lack and, aloneness and rejection and shame, all of these lower ideas, all of these lower emotions that we harbour and hold on to, they naturally begin to burn out in the presence of your awareness of consciousness. Because consciousness is that unifying field. It is the field of, people use the word love, but in truth it is the unifying field that unifies everything, every person, every animal, every tree, every being, even every ET from different planets, and you name it. If it has a form or it is existing, then behind the existence, behind the form, is still the one. So once you realise that, in truth we are all that. Beyond our sense of self, we are all that. And so once you've realised that as a state within, as your divinity is the truth of your being, then all of these lower ideas just naturally begin to burn up. And affirmations begin to fall away, because you don't need to affirm abundance, you don't need to affirm love, because in the realisation of it, there is no need to affirm it. And so over time, as you really begin to accelerate in spiritual mass, because there becomes like a threshold where you begin to really realize your core sense of self. And now your core sense of self is the very it's the foundation of which your sense of self is built upon. So my core sense of self was rejection, and then everything else was, was built upon that. So once you really get to that core signature, that signature identification that you're identified with, once you really begin to see that and move through that, the rate in which you gain spiritual mass, it has momentum. So initially when we start off, we have no idea of spirituality at all, very small sort of ideas and little glimpses through mindfulness meditation. But actually what happens is, as this, what starts off as a seedling, begins to grow, it really begins to gain pace. After a certain point, it's so well developed in itself, it's so far developed, so say starting off as like spiritual journey as a seedling or even just a seed, which is what I do. I plant seeds when I talk to people. That seed over time becomes an oak tree, and then that oak tree has such solid foundations in the earth, but we're really talking about such solid foundations in consciousness that it's gained so much mass. Let's using the oak tree, it's gained so much mass that is so deeply rooted that it's not moved. And this is kind of exactly what happens with the awakening spirituality. You gain so much mass in the knowledge of who you are that you're not moved by anything. You're not moved by your old self. So spiritual mass is all about gaining the recognition and realizing the ground of your being more and more and more and more, until the point where you're unable to be moved from it. And then that is true liberation, that is true freedom. And in that, because you are united with the one, then everything else has to follow suit. So your reality begins to catch up, begins to mirror the one, begins to mirror the harmony, begins to mirror the love, begins to mirror the abundance. And so in truth, to really shift realities, you don't need to do anything. The only thing that you truly need to do is to do the work on yourself. And that self is understanding, seeing your triggers, understanding your triggers, working through your resistance, working through your traumas, becoming more conscious of your sense of self, becoming more conscious of how your personal identity was developed, instead of being in that identity and trying to create from that identity and always coming up with the same scenarios and the same situations. You've got to challenge yourself. You have to move beyond yourself. You have to understand yourself. You have to heal yourself. And as all of this happens, you gain in spiritual mass. And as you gain in spiritual mass, you become transparent, more light, and more of a reflection of that. And as you become more of a reflection of that, that allows other people to become more of a reflection of that. For we are all one. Until next one, much love.